The quilt at Hollow Pine. The table was set for two. Cora Bishop stood in the doorway of the house she'd just bought, the one nobody on the island wanted, and stared at it. 2 plates, 2 cups, a chair pulled out, as if someone had stepped away mid-meal and simply never come back. The house had been empty for 70 years. She told herself it meant nothing. Dust, old habits, a forgotten arrangement. She set down the single bag that held everything she owned and reminded herself why she'd come. No family, no home, no one waiting. A girl with nothing left, spending her last dollars on a place too broken for anyone else. Then she saw it. Carved into the door frame, low, about the height of a child, was a name. Her name. Cora. The wood around it was gray with age, worn soft, the cuts long healed over, carved somehow, long before she was born. She traced the letters with one trembling finger, and the cold from the sea seemed to pass straight through the walls. She had come to this island to disappear, but the island, it seemed, had been waiting for her. And somewhere inside those silent rooms, a secret 70 years deep was about to wake up. The ferry came only once a week. It was an old thing, paint blistered by salt, engine coughing like a tired man climbing stairs. And on its deck, near the railing, stood a young woman with a single bag and a face that had learned, far too early, how to wait. Her name was Cora Bishop. She was 22 years old, though something in the way she held herself made her seem older. Not in her face, in her stillness, in the way she watched the water instead of the horizon, as if she had stopped expecting anything good to arrive from far away. The mainland shrank behind her. Ahead, through a curtain of gray fog, an island began to take shape. Low cliffs, dark pines, a scatter of rooftops near a crooked wooden dock, and far above the rest, perched alone on the highest point of land, a single house. That house was hers now, or it would be, the moment her boots touched the dock. She had never seen it in person. She had bought it from a faded listing and a single blurry photograph with money she could not really spare, every last dollar of it. The kind of decision people make when they have run out of softer choices. Abandoned cottage, sold as is. Most people would have read those words and turned the page. Cora had read them and felt something loosen in her chest. A house nobody wanted. A place that understood what it was to be left behind. She had spent her whole life being passed from one set of hands to another. Different houses, different last names, different people who promised gently that this time it would be different. And then weren't there any more when the seasons changed. There had been one exception. An older woman named Adeline. She had not been family, not by blood. She had simply been kind, in a quiet, unfussy way, during the years when Cora most needed someone to be. A retired teacher with chalk dust under her nails and a kettle always warm on the stove. She had taken Cora in when no one else did, and asked for nothing in return. And then, that past winter, Adeline had grown quiet in a way that did not pass. Near the end, she had taken Cora's hand. Her grip had been thin as paper, but steady. "Don't let your roots disappear," she'd whispered. Cora hadn't understood. She'd thought it was the kind of thing tired people say at the edge of sleep, a scrap of something half-remembered. She'd nodded and squeezed the old hand, and let it go. It was only after the funeral, after the small house was cleared and the kettle went cold, that the words began to follow her. Don't let your roots disappear. What roots? She had none that she knew of. No parents she could picture, no grandparents, no name behind her own name. Just a girl who had grown up belonging nowhere, drifting through the world like the fog now drifting between these pines. So when the listing appeared, a house on a forgotten island, sold cheap, sold quietly, something in her had answered before her mind could argue. Maybe she had gone looking for somewhere to disappear, or maybe, without knowing it, she had gone looking for roots. The engine slowed. The dock drew near, its planks dark and slick. A handful of people stood at the harbor's edge, watching the ferry the way small-town people watch anything new. Not unkind, just curious, wary, the way you grow wary when very little ever changes. And then, suddenly, something does. The boat bumped against the dock. A man caught the rope. He was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with a weathered face and pale eyes that seemed to take careful inventory of everything they touched. He tied off the line with the ease of long habit, then offered Cora a hand as she stepped down. "You'd be the one who bought the old place up the hill?" he said. It was not a question. "I would," she answered. His handshake was warm. His smile was warm. But his eyes lingered a half-second too long, the way a man looks at a lock he means to open later. "Name's Wendell," he said. "I run the ferry, run most things that need running around here." A small, easy laugh. "Folks tend to come to me when they've got a problem." "I don't have a problem," Cora said. "No." He glanced up the hill, toward the house she could not yet see for the trees. "Not yet." There was a pause. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, soft at the creases, as if it had been carried a long while, waiting for this moment. "Now I'll say it plain, since you'll hear it anyway," he went on. "That house isn't fit for living. Roof's gone soft. Foundation shifts in the storms. Last few owners didn't last a season." He held out the paper. "But I'm a fair man. I'd take it off your hands, pay you more than you gave, and you'd be back on the mainland by next week's ferry. Warm, dry, done with all this." For a moment, Cora simply looked at the paper in his hand. It would have been so easy. A way out before she'd even arrived. Money in her pocket. A clean retreat from a foolish decision made by a grieving girl with nowhere else to put her grief. But that was exactly the trouble. She had nowhere else. "Thank you," she said. "But I think I'll keep it." Something flickered across Wendell's face. Quick. Hard to name. Then it was gone, smoothed over by the easy smile again. "Course you will." He folded the paper, slid it back into his coat. "You change your mind. You come find me. I'm not hard to find." He nodded toward the trees. "Paths that way. Steep climb. Watch the loose stones near the top." She thanked him again and shouldered her bag and started up. Behind her, she felt his eyes follow her the whole way. The climb was longer than it looked. The path wound through pines so close together that the light fell in thin gray ribbons. The air smelled of wet bark and cold sea. Somewhere out past the cliffs, a bell buoy rang, slow and lonely, marking time for no one. And then the trees opened. And there it was, the house. It stood alone at the top of the rise, framed against a sky the color of old pewter. 2 stories, narrow, with a steep roof and a sagging porch, and tall windows gone milky with grime. The paint had peeled away in long curling strips, leaving the wood beneath bare and silvered. One shutter hung crooked, swaying just slightly, though there was barely any wind. It looked tired. It looked like it had been standing there a very long time, watching boats come and watching boats go. Watching people arrive full of hope, and watching them leave with less. And yet, it did not look frightening. It looked like it had been waiting. Cora stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her breath clouding in the cool air. "Well," she said softly, to no one. "Here we are." The words sounded strange in all that quiet, as if the house had heard them, as if, somewhere inside, something had turned its head. The key was an old iron thing, rusted nearly solid. It fought her at first, the lock stiff with decades of salt air. She worked it patiently, the way she had learned to work at most things in her life, slowly, stubbornly, without expecting it to come easy. At last the bolt gave. The door swung inward with a long, low groan, and the smell of the years came out to meet her. Salt, dust, old wood swollen by winter after winter. The particular hush of a place that has kept its own company for too long. She stepped inside. The light from the doorway spilled across a wide front room. Furniture sat beneath gray sheets, shapes hunched like sleeping animals. Cobwebs hung from the corners in soft gray veils. A tall clock stood against one wall, its hands frozen, its face clouded, stopped at some hour no one had bothered to remember. It was hers. Every cracked board, every leaking corner, every shadow. She set her bag down by the cold hearth and breathed it in. And that was when she saw the table. It stood in the next room, just past an open doorway. A small wooden table, the kind a family might gather around. And it was set. Not for one. For two. 2 plates, faded but whole. 2 cups. 2 folded cloths gone yellow with age. And 1 chair pulled slightly back from the table, at an angle, as if someone had risen from it in the middle of a meal and stepped away and simply never returned. Cora went still. The house had been empty for decades. She knew that. She had been told that more than once by more than one mouth. And yet here was a table set as though supper were only minutes off, as though the kettle were about to sing. She told herself there was a reason. Old habit. A previous owner's idea of staging. Or simply a thing left behind, the way the dead leave behind their dishes, their shoes, their half-finished cups of tea. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. But her hand, when she reached out to touch the rim of one cup, was not quite steady. The cup was cold. Of course it was cold. She drew her hand back, and it was then, turning to leave that room, that she saw the door frame. She might have missed it entirely. The light was dim, and the wood was gray with age, and the marks were low, very low, down near the bottom, at the height of a small child reaching up with a careful hand. But something caught her eye. A pattern in the grain that was not the grain. Letters. Cora crouched. She brushed the dust away with the edge of her sleeve and squinted, and slowly. The shapes came clear. Carved into the soft old wood, deep and deliberate, was a name: Cora. Her breath left her in a single, soundless rush. For a long moment she could not move. She knelt there on the cold floor, one hand pressed to the frame, staring at the 4 letters as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Her name, in this house, a house she had bought blind, from a faded listing, with the last of a dead woman's kindness. She ran her thumb along the cuts. The edges were soft, worn smooth, darkened with age. This was not new. This had not been done last week or last year. The wood had grown dark around the letters the way it does over long, slow years. Older, somehow, than it had any right to be. As if it had been waiting here for her, since before she was born. "That's not possible," she whispered. But the letters did not change. Somewhere above her, deep in the body of the house, a beam shifted with a low, settling moan. The sound rolled through the walls and faded. And in the silence that followed, Cora felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, exactly. Something stranger. The feeling of having walked into a story that had begun long before she arrived, and of being, somehow, expected. She did not sleep much that first night. The electricity was long dead, the wires likely chewed through by the years. She found a glass lantern in a kitchen cabinet, and a tin of matches that had somehow stayed dry, and she made herself a small pool of light in the front room beside the cold hearth. She did not go near the table again. She told herself she would deal with it in the morning, in the daylight, when things looked like what they were, and not like what the dark wanted them to be. She wrapped herself in the 2 blankets she had brought and lay down on the floor and listened. The house was not quiet. Old houses never are. The wind found the gaps in the walls and made them sing. The shutters tapped, soft and arrhythmic. Somewhere upstairs, a board would creak, settle, then creak again a long moment later, as if a slow weight were crossing a room she could not see. More than once she sat up, certain she had heard a footstep. More than once she held her breath and waited. But there was only the dark, and the wind, and the long, low sigh of the sea against the cliffs below. She thought about Adeline then, about the warm kitchen and the kettle and the chalk dust, about the way the old woman used to hum while she worked, some tune with no name that seemed to fill a room with safety. "Don't let your roots disappear." Cora turned the words over in the dark, the way she had turned them over 100 times since the winter, and for the first time, lying on the floor of a house that had carved her name into its bones before she ever drew breath. She wondered if Adeline had known something. It was a foolish thought. She put it away, but it did not stay away. It lay beside her in the dark, patient, the whole night through. Morning came gray and slow. The fog had thinned, but not lifted. Pale light leaked through the milky windows and lay across the dusty floor in long, soft rectangles. Cora rose, stiff and cold, her back aching from the boards, and for a few moments she simply stood at the window, looking out at the sea. It was beautiful, in a hard sort of way. The water silver, the cliffs dark, a single gull turning slow circles above the waves. No traffic, no voices, no reminders of all she'd lost. just quiet. The kind of quiet she had spent most of her life looking for, without ever quite believing she'd find it. And so she did what she had always done when the past pressed too close. She worked. She found a bucket and a stiff old brush. She hauled water from the rain barrel by the back door, and she scrubbed. The kitchen counters first, black with grime, then the windows, until the gray light came through a little cleaner. She pulled the sheets off the furniture and beat the dust from them in the cold air, coughing, eyes watering, her arms aching in a way that felt almost good. It was honest work, simple. It asked nothing of her but effort, and gave back the small, steady comfort of a thing made better than it was before. For the first time in months, she was not thinking about grief. She was thinking about a clean window, a swept floor, a room reclaimed inch by inch from the long years of neglect. She did not touch the table. She cleaned the rooms around it. She swept up to its edges. But she left the 2 plates and the 2 cups exactly where they sat, untouched, as if some quiet part of her was not ready to disturb whatever it was they were waiting for. By midday, she allowed herself a rest. She sat on the porch steps with a cup of plain water and looked out over the trees, down toward the harbor and the gray curve of the sea. From up here, the world looked very small. The dock, the handful of roofs, the single gull, still turning. And in that small world, something moved. Down at the tree line, where the path met the clearing, a figure stood. Cora went still. It was a man, broad shoulders, a dark coat. He stood at the edge of the pines, not approaching, not calling out, simply watching the house, the way a man studies a thing he means to come back for. Wendell. She raised her hand, half a greeting, half a question. For a moment he did not move. Then he lifted one hand in return, slow, and turned, and was gone back into the trees. She sat there a while longer after he'd left, telling herself it was nothing. A man checking on a stranger, small-town habit, neighborly concern. But the warmth of his handshake and the cool patience of his eyes did not sit easily together in her memory. She went back inside and back to work. It was late in the afternoon, in an upstairs room thick with dust, that she found the hat box. The room had clearly been a bedroom once. A narrow iron bed frame stood against one wall, its mattress long gone. A wardrobe leaned in the corner, its door hanging open on a single hinge, and on the high shelf inside, pushed far back into the shadows, sat a round box, the kind women once used to store their hats. It was tied with a faded ribbon. Cora reached up, stretching onto her toes, and worked it free. Dust rained down. The box was heavier than she expected, and something inside shifted with a soft, papery slide. She carried it to the window, where the dying light could reach. She sat down on the dusty floor with the box in her lap, and she untied the ribbon, and she lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, old ones, their edges soft and curling, their colors faded to browns and silvers. She lifted the first few carefully, one at a time, turning them toward the gray window light. A view of the cliffs, a boat at the dock, the house itself, younger, its paint still whole, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney, and then a face. Cora's hands stopped. The photograph showed a girl, young, perhaps 20, standing on the porch of this very house, one hand shading her eyes against a sun that had set decades ago. She was smiling, just slightly, the way a person smiles when they don't quite trust the camera. And she had Cora's face, not a resemblance, not a family likeness, the kind that makes people say you have your mother's eyes. The same face, the same dark hair falling the same way, the same narrow chin, the same set of the shoulders. And there, above the left eyebrow, the same small scar, pale against the skin, that Cora had carried for as long as she could remember and had never known how she got. Cora's breath came short and shallow. She turned the photograph over with fingers that would not stay still. There was no name on the back, no place, only a single line, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand, the ink faded almost to nothing. 3 words: "Before the sea." She did not understand it. She set the photograph down on the floor in front of her, gently, as though it might break. Then she lifted the next one from the box. The same girl. On the beach this time, her skirt caught by the wind. And the next. The same girl seated at a table. This table, Cora realized, the small wooden one downstairs, laughing at something beyond the frame. And the next, and the next. Again and again, that face, her face, in a time long before she had been alive. Standing in rooms she had just that morning swept clean, smiling on a porch where she had sat only hours ago with a cup of water in her hand. The light in the room was failing now. The gray at the window had deepened toward dark, and outside the wind was beginning to rise again, stirring the pines, rattling the crooked shutter, carrying with it the first far-off sigh of a storm still out over the water. Cora sat very still in the gathering dark. The photograph spread around her like fallen leaves. A girl with her face. A name carved into a door frame before she was born. A table set for 2 in a house that had been empty for the better part of a lifetime. And a soft old voice, somewhere in her memory, saying the things she had not understood. Don't let your roots disappear. She had come to this island to vanish, to find a quiet corner of the world where the past could not follow her quite so loudly. But sitting there in the failing light, with that face gazing up at her from a photograph older than she was, Cora understood, with a slow and certain dread, that she had not come here to escape her past at all. She had come here to find it, and somewhere in the silent rooms around her, in the walls, beneath the floors, behind the still and patient hush of a house that had carved her name and waited. A secret 70 years deep was beginning, very quietly, to wake. She did not yet know what it was. She did not yet know what it would cost her to learn. But she knew, the way you know a thing in your bones before your mind will say it out loud, that the girl who had stepped off that ferry with a single bag and nothing left to lose was not going to be the same girl who walked back down to the dock. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain struck the window, and in the dark house on the hill, the young woman gathered the photographs into her lap and held them against her chest and stared into the deepening shadows and waited for the morning that would change everything. The storm passed sometime before the dawn. It left the island washed and dripping, The pines bent low and glistening, the sea still heaving gray beneath a sky that had not yet made up its mind about the light. Rain hung in beads along the eaves. The crooked shutter had finally torn loose in the night and lay flat in the wet grass below the window, like something the storm had pulled down and forgotten. And in the house on the hill, the young woman woke on the floor. The photographs were still scattered around her, exactly where they had slipped from her fingers when sleep finally came and took the pen out of her hands, so to speak. For a moment, in that soft and forgiving space between dreaming and waking, Cora forgot all of it. Then she saw the face. The girl in the photograph gazed up at her from the dusty boards, smiling that small, uncertain smile across a gulf of years that should have made her a stranger. Her face, the same dark hair, the same narrow chin, the same pale scar above the brow that Cora had carried for as long as memory would reach, and had never once been able to explain. And it all came rushing back. The table set for two. The name cut low into the doorframe. The cold and certain feeling, settling deeper now in the gray morning, that she had not chosen this house at all. That, somehow, it had chosen her. She sat up slowly. Her back ached from the floor. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold. Outside the window, the world was rinsed and still. A single bird called once, somewhere in the wet pines, then thought better of it and fell silent. And there, on the cold boards of a house that had carved her name before she was born, Cora made a decision that surprised her. She would not run. She had spent her whole life running. From grief, from hope, from the dangerous softness of letting herself belong to a place, or a person, or a name. She had grown so practiced at leaving that she had nearly forgotten there was another way to live. Stay too long, and you learn to love something. Love something, and you gave the world one more thing it could take. That had been her arithmetic for years. But the girl in the photograph had her face, and the woman who had loved her, at the gentle end of a long life, had pressed her thin hand and asked her not to let her roots disappear. Cora gathered the photographs, one by one. She stacked them with care on the windowsill, the girl with her face turned to the top so that the morning light fell across it. "All right," she said softly, to the quiet, to the house, to the girl. "Let's find out who you are." She did not get far before the knock came. It was mid-morning by then. The light through the milky glass had warmed from iron to a thin and watery gold. Cora was standing in the front room, crouched again before the carved name, tracing the worn letters and trying to make them tell her something more than they had, when 3 slow raps sounded against the front door. She froze. For one foolish moment her heart climbed straight into her throat. Then her breath came out long and steady. A knock meant a person, and people, as a rule, had never frightened her half so much as the silence did. She opened the door. Wendell stood on the porch, a covered basket hooked over one broad arm. "Morning," he said. The easy smile was back, warm as fresh bread. "Storm gave you a rough sort of welcome, I'd wager. Household together up here?" "Mostly," Cora said. "Lost a shutter." "They do that." He nodded down at the basket. "Brought you a few things. Bread. Some preserves the women put up. Folks down the hill aren't much for company, but they're not unkind when it comes to a full pantry." He held the basket out across the threshold. Cora hesitated. Then she took it. It would have been ungracious not to, and she had eaten little since the mainland, and the bread, when her fingers found it through the cloth, was still faintly warm. "Thank you," she said. "Least a body can do." He did not leave. He stood a moment longer on the porch, and his pale eyes moved past her, into the house. Not openly, not rudely. Just a slow, easy flick of the gaze, the way a man counts the coins in a stranger's hand without seeming to look at all. The swept floor, the lantern burned low, the folded sheets stacked in the corner. "You've been busy," he said. "There's a lot to do." "There is." A pause. And then his eyes drifted, almost lazily, toward the open doorway at the back of the room, toward the small room beyond, toward the table she had still not touched. "Funny old house. Seen a lot of owners come through. None of 'em ever lasted out a winter." "So I keep hearing," Cora said. He shifted his weight. The porch board groaned beneath his boot. His gaze stayed on that back doorway a moment too long, then came back to her, mild and friendly as ever. "Find anything interesting yet? People always think these old places are stuffed with treasure." A soft laugh. "Mostly it's mice and damp and somebody's forgotten junk." It was a light question, friendly, the kind of thing any neighbor might ask. But something in the careful stillness behind his eyes made Cora's answer come slow. "Just dust," she said, "and a lot of work." For a heartbeat, he held her gaze. And in that heartbeat, she felt, plainly, that he was weighing her, measuring the truth of her words, the way a man tests the weight of a sack before he names a price. Then the smile widened and broke the moment, and he stepped back. "Well, offer still stands, you understand. Anytime you decide this island's more trouble than it's worth, you come find me. I'd hate to watch a young thing like you waste a whole winter up here, all alone. Nobody to know if you took a bad step on those cliffs." It might have been concern. It landed like something else. "I'll keep it in mind," Cora said. He nodded once and touched the brim of his cap and turned and went back down the path into the dripping trees. And Cora stood in the doorway a long while after he had gone, the warm basket heavy in her hands, a cold feeling settling slow and quiet in her chest. Because she had not told him about the table. She had told no one. There had been no one to tell. And yet his eyes had gone straight to that back doorway, as if he already knew, without being shown, exactly what was waiting beyond it. The grounds behind the house were a tangle. What had once been a garden had gone wild over the long abandoned years, a knot of bramble and thorn and grasping vine, half swallowing the remains of a low stone wall, a leaning shed with its roof caved in, a rusted gate that swung open onto nothing at all. Cora pushed into it slowly that afternoon, her sleeves pulled down against the thorns, her boots sinking in the storm-soft earth. She could not have said exactly what she was searching for. She only knew the answer was not in the house. The house had given her its riddles, the name, the table, the face. But a riddle is not an answer. And something deep in her, some patient and stubborn instinct she had learned to trust over a hard life, told her the answers had been put somewhere the years could not easily reach. Somewhere a person hides a thing when they mean it to outlast them. She found it near the far wall, where the brambles grew thickest of all. At first it looked like nothing, a long hummock of earth, overgrown, no different from a dozen other swells in the wild ground. But the line of it was too straight, too deliberate for the careless work of weather and time. And when she knelt and pulled the creeping vines aside with raw and stinging fingers, she felt her hands strike wood. Two heavy doors, set at a slant into the earth itself. A cellar, not the kind that lives beneath a house, the kind built apart from it, dug down into the cold ground, the sort of low stone room where people once kept what they wished to keep cold, or safe, or far from any passing eye. The doors were bound shut by years of ivy and a single rusted latch. Cora worked at them. The ivy fought her. The latch fought her harder. Her breath came in clouds, and her hands grew raw and red, and more than once she sat back on her heels and very nearly gave it up. But she thought of the face on the window-sill, and she bent again to the work. At last, with a groan that seemed to roll up out of the very ground, the doors gave way and fell open against the wet grass. Cold air breathed out of the dark below. It smelled of old stone and damp earth, and beneath those, faint and clean and strange, something almost sweet. Stone steps led down into shadow. Cora went back to the house for the lantern, and then, with the small flame trembling before her, she descended. The room below was small and dry, and far more whole than the wild ruin above had any right to promise. The walls were close and cool, fitted stone, mortared with care. The ceiling arched low overhead so that she could stand only just upright. Dust lay over everything in a soft gray skin, undisturbed for years beyond counting. And yet there was none of the rot, none of the sour, creeping damp that had wormed its way through every corner of the house on the hill. As if this place had been built against time itself, as if someone had made it to keep something waiting. Cora lifted the lantern higher. Shelves lined one wall, bare now but for a few clouded glass jars. A plain wooden chair sat in the corner, patient, as though it had only just been left. And against the far wall, beneath a folded sheet, gone gray as ash, sat a trunk. Cedar. That was the sweet smell. Cedar, faint beneath the dust. The wood that keeps the years and the moths at bay. The wood people choose when they are thinking not of this season, but of seasons they will not be alive to see. She crossed the small room slowly. Her heart had begun to beat hard against her ribs. The trunk was not locked, but it had been wrapped, before it was set down here, in oilcloth gone brittle with age. Wrapped the way a thing is wrapped when someone means it to survive the long, dark, and the slow years. When someone is thinking of a stranger who has not yet been born. She knelt. She set the lantern beside her on the stone floor, and gently, carefully, she peeled the brittle oilcloth away. Then she lifted the lid. The hinges let out a long, soft sigh, like a breath held for too long and finally let go. Inside, folded with great and obvious care, lay a quilt. It was old. The colors had softened with the passing of the years, blues gone to the gray of a winter sky, reds faded to the palest rose. But the work was very fine. The stitches small and even and patient, the kind of stitching that carries a woman through many long winters by a single lamp, a little each night, year upon year. And it was not finished. Cora saw that at once. Along one edge, the pattern simply stopped. A row of empty squares ran the length of the hem, the cloth pieced and ready, but not yet worked with its design. As though the maker had set down her needle one quiet evening, meaning to take it up again with the morning, and never had. Cora lifted the quilt out, gently as you lift a sleeping child, and she unfolded it across the cold stone floor in the wavering lantern light, smoothing it flat with both hands. And then she went very still, because the quilt was not only a quilt. The pattern was a place. She saw it the way a hidden thing comes suddenly clear when you stop staring at the parts and let the whole rise up to meet you. The long gray-blue shape running down the center. That was water. The dark green knots, stitched thick and close. Those were trees. There, a small square the color of old bone, set high upon a stitched rise. The house. There, a thin pale thread winding down through all that green. The path. The harbor. The dock. The curve of the cliffs. The island. Someone had stitched the whole of the island into this quilt, patient square by patient square, season after season after season, the way other women stitch flowers, or stars, or the names of their children. Cora's breath came shallow now. She knelt above it and traced the stitched paths with one unsteady finger. The house, the shore, the trees, and there, deep in the heart of the stitched forest, far from the house, far from the harbor and the watching dock, a single square, worked in a darker thread than all the rest, marked, set apart, as though it mattered more than every other stitch in the cloth. She did not yet know what it was, but she knew it had been placed there on purpose, by a hand that wanted someday, in some season it would never see, for someone to find it. And then her eye fell on the hem. Along the very bottom edge of the quilt, beneath the last finished row, ran a line of fine embroidery. Words, stitched small and close, the thread faded nearly to the color of the cloth around them. She had to bend low, the lantern almost touching the fabric, the heat of it warm against her cheek, before the shapes would resolve. 4 words. She is still alive. Cora sat back on her heels. The cellar seemed to press closer around her. The lantern flame leaned, though there was no breath of wind to move it. And those 4 small stitched words swam before her eyes, refusing to settle into any sense that she could hold in her 2 hands. She is still alive. Who? The girl in the photographs? But the photographs were so old. The girl in them would be far along in years now, an old woman, if she breathed at all. And who would stitch such a thing into the hem of a quilt, in thread, with a needle, by lamplight, as though it were not a secret to be whispered, but a quiet promise, kept and tended across the years? Cora pressed her open hand flat against the stitched words, as if she might feel the truth of them through her palm, the way you feel a pulse. And then she reached back into the cedar trunk. Beneath the place where the quilt had lain, wrapped in its own square of soft cloth, was a book, a journal. It was not like the photographs. The photographs had been kept, stored, the cool relics of a thing long finished. This had been used. The leather cover was worn soft at every corner. The page edges were darkened with the oil of many fingers, turned and returned over a long stretch of days. Someone had carried this, opened it, written in it, lived alongside it, season after season. Cora lifted it out with both hands as though it had a weight beyond its weight. She sat down on the cold stone floor, her back against the close stone wall, the lantern at her side, and she opened the book to its first page. There was a name there, just a name, written large and careful at the top of the page, the way a person writes a name when they want to be very sure it will not be lost. Nell. Cora stared at it. The name meant nothing to her, and yet, looking at it in the trembling light, she felt the fine hairs rise along her arms. Some feeling she could not put words to moved through her, slow and deep. A kind of recognition that came from somewhere far beneath thought, from a place older than memory. She turned the page and began to read. The early entries were simple things: the weather, the shifting moods of the sea, the small daily rhythms of a life lived very close to the water. The writer had a clear, plain way with words, the way of a person who taught herself to write with care, because there was no one near to write to. But beneath the plainness, even from the first pages, ran something else, a wariness, a sense of a life lived just out of sight. One early page read, "The fog is a kindness. The fog keeps the cove hidden. On the clear days she stays within doors, and does not sing." Another further along. A boat came near the rocks today. They watched from inside the trees until it passed on. The child did not make a single sound. She has learned now how to be quiet, and it breaks something in a person to have to teach a child to be that quiet. Cora's brow drew together. Above her, the wind found the gap where the cellar doors stood open, and the lantern flame ducked low, then steadied. She pulled her coat closer about her shoulders and read on. She turned the soft pages slowly, and the story behind them began, piece by piece, to take its shape in the lantern light. There had been a child, a little girl, here, on this very island, in a time long before Cora drew her first breath. And something had happened to that child, something the writer never quite set down in plain words, but circled again and again, the way a tongue keeps returning to a sore tooth. The island had been told the girl was gone, drowned, the story went, taken by the sea on a gray and ordinary day, the way the sea will sometimes take the small and the unlucky. The men had said it, the harbor had repeated it, and the island, which had always loved its quiet far more than it loved its questions, had chosen, gratefully, to believe. But the sea had not taken her. She had been hidden. One page, near the middle of the book, made Cora stop and read it through 3 times over. They told the island she had drowned. It was easier than the truth. A drowned child is mourned for a season, and then she is finished, and the water keeps her. A hidden child is a danger that never ends. But the sea gave nothing back to bury, because the sea was never given anything at all. She was here. She was always here, kept close, kept quiet, kept safe from the ones who would have done to her far worse than the water ever could. Cora lowered the book to her lap. The lantern flame trembled and threw her shadow huge and wavering across the close stone wall. A hidden child, kept safe from someone. From people who, the writer hinted in line after careful line, had wanted the girl gone for reasons no child should ever have been made to carry on her small shoulders. And the island had simply agreed to forget. The thought sat cold and heavy in Cora's chest. She thought of the warm basket of bread up in the house, the friendly, careful eyes of the man who ran the ferry, who ran most things, who came, he had said, when there was a problem to be smoothed away. She thought of how very quiet a small place can keep itself, when the quiet is so much easier than the truth. She turned more pages. The girl in the journal grew slowly across the years. The writer recorded all of it. A first tooth, lost and wept over. A fear of thunder, slowly outgrown. A gift for finding the hidden nests of birds along the cliffs. Small things, tender things, ordinary things, made strange and aching by the single fact that every one of them had to be hidden from the world. A whole childhood lived in the narrow spaces between the fog. And then, near the back of the worn book, Cora found a page that stopped her heart entirely. It was a different kind of entry. Not about the weather, not about the growing girl. It was about a name. The page read, "If these words are ever found, then the long silence has broken at last. Know that the family it touched was small and frightened, and did the only thing it knew how to do. Know that the name they tried to bury was a good name, a kind name. The name was given to the child. And the child, when she was grown and gone far from this place, would one day give it again, to a daughter of her own. And perhaps that daughter, in her turn, to a daughter after her." Below that, set apart on its own line, was the name itself. And Cora, reading it, felt the whole cold cellar tilt beneath her, because it was a name she knew, not her own, not Bishop. That name had come from one of the houses she had passed through as a girl, handed to her like a borrowed coat that never quite fit across the shoulders. This was a different name, an older one, a name she had heard spoken aloud exactly once, at the very end, from a mouth gone thin and gray in the last fading days of a woman she could scarcely remember. Her mother, the one who had slipped out of Cora's life so early that she was less a memory than a feeling, a warmth, a voice, a song half heard in the dark before sleep. But there had been one thing, one word her mother had whispered near the end, holding her small daughter close against her, the way a person hands over something precious that they have no more time to explain. Here it was, written in this journal, in the careful hand of a woman named Nell, who had hidden a child away on a forgotten island, a lifetime before Cora was ever born. Cora sat in the cold and the lantern light, the open journal in her lap, and felt the whole shape of her life shift quietly beneath her feet, the way the deck of the ferry had shifted as it pulled away from the only shore she knew. This was not a mystery she had stumbled into. This was a mystery she had come from. The hidden girl, the buried name, the face in the photographs that was her own face, looking back at her across all those years. The single word her mother had pressed into her like a seed. The roots that Adeline, with her last gentle strength, had begged her not to let disappear. It was all one thing. It had been one thing all along. She did not yet know how. She did not yet know the whole of it. But she knew, sitting in that small stone room that someone had built to keep the truth safe and waiting, that she was no stranger here. She was the very thing the house had been waiting for. The lantern was burning low. Cora became aware of it slowly, the way a person becomes aware of cold after sitting too long still. The light had shrunk to a small wavering coin of gold, and the dark had crept in close around the edges of the little room. She gathered herself. She wrapped the journal once more in its square of cloth. She folded the quilt with great care, the way you fold a thing that matters more than its weight, and she held it against her chest as she climbed the worn stone steps back up into the world above. It was evening. The fog had come rolling back in, soft and gray, drifting between the dripping pines like something patient and alive. The house stood dark against the last pale light low in the western sky, and far down the hill, through the trees, a single window glowed. One small warm point of yellow in all that cold and gathering gray. The harbor. Wendell's window. Like as not. A man, awake, watching the dark come down. Cora stood at the open mouth of the cellar, the quilt held tight in her arms, and the journal pressed beneath it. And she looked down at that one distant light for a long, long moment. She thought of the careful question on the porch. Find anything interesting yet? She thought of the pale eyes that had gone straight to the table, and she understood, with a quiet and growing certainty, that whatever had been hidden away on this island had not been hidden from her. It had been hidden from them, and someone down there, in that small warm room beside the water, was still very interested in keeping it that way. She carried the quilt inside. She lit a fresh lantern. She did not lie down. She did not even think of sleep. She spread the quilt across the floor of the front room and smoothed it flat, and knelt above it in the soft and wavering light, studying the stitched island, square by patient square, the house, the path, the shore, and there, deep in the heart of the stitched forest, far from everything and everyone, that single, darker square, marked, set apart, waiting. She pressed her fingertip to it and held it there. Whatever it was, it lay out there in the pines, away from the harbor and the watching window, away from the easy smiles and the careful, weighing eyes, a place the maker of this quilt had thought worth stitching into cloth, so that it would not be lost when she herself was gone. A place that someone had left across all these years for Cora to find. The journal had given her a name, and a face, and the first cold edge of the truth. But the answer, the whole of it, was not in the house. It was out there, in the trees. At the place the quilt called by no name, marked only in dark thread, keeping its long silence in the deep green heart of the island. Cora knelt over the stitched map until the second lantern burned down to almost nothing, and the first gray light of another morning began to seep, thin and cold, through the cleaned glass of the windows. And when at last she rose, stiff and cold and certain, she found that she was not afraid. She felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. She felt called. Outside, the fog was already lifting. The path into the pines lay waiting, pale and winding, exactly where the quilt had promised it would be. And the young woman who had come to this island to vanish stood at the window with the stitched map warm in her hands and looked toward the trees, toward the secret still keeping itself in the green dark, and understood at last that the only way back to herself now led forward, into the forest, to the place the quilt had been waiting all these long years to show her. The morning came up pale and clean. The fog had pulled back to the edges of the water, lying low along the shore like something resting, and the pines stood dark and still and dripping in the new light. Cora stood at the door of the house with the quilt folded over one arm and the journal buttoned safe inside her coat, and she looked out at the wall of trees the way a person looks at the edge of a thing they cannot turn back from once begun. The path was there, just as the stitching had promised, a thin pale thread of old trail, half swallowed by moss and fern, winding away from the clearing and into the green dark. She had spent the early hours studying the quilt by the cold morning light until the lines of it were burned behind her eyes. She knew the way now, or thought she did. The path through the trees, the fork where it split, the long curve along the high ground, and then the single darker square, deep in the heart of it all, that the Maker had set apart from everything else. She had also seen the small thing she had missed before. In each corner of the quilt, stitched so fine it nearly vanished into the cloth, was a tiny bird, wings open, lifting. 4 little birds, holding the whole island in their flight. She did not know what they meant, but she found. She stepped off the porch and onto the soft trail, that the image stayed with her. A small thing, taking wing, going up and out and away from whatever had held it down. The forest closed around her. It was older here than she had imagined. The trees stood close and tall, their trunks thick and dark with damp, their branches knitting together overhead until the light fell only in thin gray ribbons. The air smelled of cold earth and cedar and the green breath of growing things. Her boots made almost no sound on the soft and rotting needles. She walked. For a long while there was nothing but the trees and the trail and the slow, steady beat of her own heart. Once a bird startled up from the brush ahead of her, a clatter of wings, and her breath caught hard before she laughed at herself, soft and shaky, in all that quiet. She checked the quilt at the fork, took the left-hand path, the higher one, the way the stitching ran, and then she began to find the marks. The first was a post, old, weathered nearly to driftwood, leaning hard to one side where the earth had given way beneath it over the long years. Most of whatever had once been carved or painted on it was gone. But near the top, faint beneath the gray, she could just make it out. A small bird, wings open, the same bird as the corners of the quilt. Cora stood before it a long moment, her fingertips resting against the soft and rotting wood. Someone had marked this path long ago. Someone had wanted certain people to find their way along it, and had trusted that the right person, someday, would know the sign when they saw it. She went on. She found another post further along, and another. Each one carried the fated bird. Each one stood at a turning where the trail grew faint and might have been lost, as though whoever placed them had thought carefully about exactly where a frightened traveler would falter and need to know they were still going the right way. The thought moved something in her. These were not the marks of someone hiding a thing away. They were the marks of someone leaving a thread for the lost to follow. The trail climbed, the trees thinned just slightly, and then, through a gap in the dark green, Cora saw it. A building. She stopped at the edge of a small clearing and simply looked. It was not what she had pictured. In her mind, she had built something grim. A cabin with barred windows, perhaps. A locked and lightless place where a child had been kept hidden from the world, the way the journal's careful, circling words had seemed to suggest. This was nothing like that. It was a low, long building of weathered gray wood, with a steep little roof and a small bell tower at one end, the bell long gone, the frame empty against the sky. Tall windows ran along one side, most of the glass still whole, clouded but unbroken. A wide stone step led up to a door that had once been painted, the color faded now to the ghost of blue. A schoolhouse, the kind that small and far-flung places once built, a single room for all the children at once, set apart in the quiet where young minds could learn without the noise of the world. It had not been a prison. It had been a school. Cora crossed the clearing slowly, her boots wet in the long grass, and climbed the worn stone step and pushed open the faded blue door. It gave with a long, low sigh. Inside, the light came soft and gray through the tall windows, falling across a room that had waited a long time in stillness. There were the remains of small desks, pushed to one side. A larger desk at the front, where a teacher would have stood. A cold iron stove in the center, its pipe rising up through the roof. Shelves along the back wall, holding a few swollen and ruined books. And the walls. The walls stopped her where she stood. They were covered in photographs, dozens of them, rows upon rows, pinned and tacked and pasted across the gray old boards, from one end of the room to the other. Cora moved toward them slowly, the way you move toward something you are half afraid to understand. And as she came close, she saw. They were all the same face. Nell, the girl from the photographs in the hat box, the girl with Cora's own face. But here, the pictures did not stop at 20. Here, they went on. She saw the girl at 7, small and solemn, standing in this very doorway. She saw her at 10, laughing, a book held open in her lap. At 14, at 20, at 30, the face fuller now, the eyes the same. At 40, at 50, on and on, down the long wall, the same face moving through the years, growing older, the dark hair going slowly to gray, the scar above the brow holding steady through it all. A whole life pinned to the wall of a forgotten schoolhouse in the heart of a forest. A life that the world had been told ended in the water long ago. Cora's hand rose to her own brow, to the small pale scar there, without her quite meaning it to. The girl had not drowned. She had lived. She had grown up here, in this hidden room among the trees, learning to read and to write, and to find the nests of birds, kept safe and kept quiet across all the long years, and she had lived on, and on, far past the day the harbor had mourned her and forgotten her and let her go. But it was more than that. As Cora moved along the wall, she saw the other photographs, smaller, tucked between and around the pictures of Nell. Other faces, a young woman with frightened eyes, holding a cup of something warm, an older woman, gray and gaunt, sitting by the iron stove with a blanket around her shoulders, the ghost of a smile on her tired face. A boy, half grown, asleep in a chair. Strangers, all of them. And beneath the photographs, on the shelves, on the desks, in careful little stacks, were the things they had left behind. A child's mitten, a folded square of paper, soft with handling, a smooth stone, a button, and notes. Dozens of notes in dozens of different hands, some neat, some shaking, tucked beneath the photographs like prayers left at a shrine. Cora lifted one. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. This was the first place that did not ask me to pretend I was well. She set it down, lifted another. I came here with nothing left. I leave with enough. And another. The hand shaky, the letters large. Thank you for keeping the door open. Cora stood in the soft gray light, surrounded by the faces and the words of strangers, and felt the whole understanding of the place turn over inside her. This had not been only a hiding place. It had become a refuge. Over the long years, others had found their way here, following the birds, following the thread, people with frightened eyes and empty hands, women with nowhere left to go, the grieving, the lost, the ones the world had stopped looking for. Each one had come carrying some unbearable weight, and each one, it seemed, had set a little of it down here, in this quiet room among the trees, before going on. The girl who had been hidden away to be saved had grown into a woman who spent her life saving others. Cora's eyes stung. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed, slow, in the stillness. And that was when she heard it. The soft groan of the blue door behind her. The creak of a heavy boot on the old floorboards. She turned. Wendell stood in the doorway. He filled it, broad and dark against the pale light of the clearing behind him. The easy smile was gone now. His pale eyes moved past her, across the wall of photographs, across the faces and the notes, with an expression she could not at first read. It was not anger. It was something older, wearier, something that looked almost like grief. So, he said quietly, you found it. Cora did not answer at once. Her heart was beating hard, but her feet stayed where they were. She thought of the path, and the birds, and the long way back through the trees, and she understood that she had been followed, quietly, the whole way. You knew it was here, she said, my whole life. He stepped inside, slow, and let the door swing shut behind him. The light dimmed. Grew up hearing about it, the way you grow up hearing about a thing nobody's allowed to say out loud. He stopped a few paces from her. His gaze went again to the wall, to the long parade of one face through all its years, and something in him seemed to fold inward. They told the island a child drowned, he said. A long time ago. Before your time. Before mine. A long breath. It wasn't true. You've worked that much out, I expect. She was hidden, Cora said. To keep her safe. To keep her safe. Wendell's mouth twisted, bitter. From the people who were supposed to keep her. That's the part nobody likes to say. He looked down at his own broad hands. There was a family then, on this island, a proud one, did well for itself, and the easiest way to stay proud and do well was to be rid of a child who'd come to be inconvenient, a child who knew something, or was something, that a proud family didn't want known. Cora's breath went still. And so the story became a drowning, Wendell went on, low. A sad accident, a thing the sea did, and the island, being the island, found it easier to nod along than to ask the hard question. A few good people couldn't stop the lie. So instead, they hid the truth where the lie couldn't reach it. Here, in the trees. They hid the girl, and they kept her alive. He fell silent. The stove ticked, though it was cold. The light shifted as a cloud passed over the clearing. Why are you telling me this? Cora asked. Wendell raised his eyes to hers. And there it was, at last, beneath the weariness, the fear. Because that proud family, he said, was mine. The words sat in the room a long moment. My grandfather's people, he said, quieter still. It was them, their name, their pride, their lie. And when it was done, when the girl was hidden and the island had its sad story to tell, they prospered. The way you prosper when you've cut away the thing that troubled you. They came to own the boats, the dock, the road off this rock, and the road onto it. A thin, humorless sound. Me, I'm what's left of all that prospering. The man folks come to when there's a problem. He looked at her and his voice dropped to almost nothing. And you, girl. You walking around up at that house, pulling up floorboards, opening trunks. You are a problem. Cora felt the cold settle in her chest, but she did not step back. You want me to be quiet, she said. I want you to be safe, Wendell said, and he almost seemed to mean it. There's nothing left to fix. The ones who did it are long gone, long dead. All that's left is a name and a town, and a story everybody's comfortable believing. You drag the truth out into the light now, and what does it buy you? You shame the dead. You shame the living who never asked to be born to it. You make enemies of every soul down that hill who'd rather not have their grandparents' silence written on their faces. He spread his hands. Or, you take the offer. You let me buy the house. You go back to the mainland with money in your pocket and your whole life ahead of you. And you let the dead stay buried. It was, Cora understood, the same lie he had been raised inside. That the kindest thing, the easiest thing, was to let the quiet go on. She looked at the wall, at the face that was her own face, moving through all its hidden years, at the strangers Nell had sheltered, at the notes left by the lost. Thank you for keeping the door open. And she thought of a girl, taught to be so quiet that something broke in the one who had to teach her. No, Cora said, just the one word. Soft. But it filled the room. Wendell's jaw tightened. Think hard, he said. I have. She felt something steady rising in her, something she had not known she carried. You said there's nothing left to fix. You're wrong. There's her." She gestured to the wall, to the long life pinned across it. A whole person the world was told to forget. There's every one of these strangers she opened the door for when nobody had ever opened a door for her. And there's the truth, Wendell. The truth is still here. It's been here the whole time, waiting, while everybody agreed not to look at it. Her voice did not shake. "I'm not going to agree." He stared at her, and for a moment something moved behind the fear in his eyes. Something that might, in a different life, have been relief. But he only shook his head, slow and heavy, and turned toward the door. "Then, you don't understand what you're walking into," he said. "This island has kept its quiet a long, long time. You think the truth will set anybody free." He paused, his hand on the faded blue door. "Out here, the truth just makes you alone." And he went out into the pale light and was gone among the trees. Cora stood a long while in the stillness after he had left. Then she turned back to the wall. And it was then, looking again at the long line of photographs, the whole hidden life laid out in faded squares, that her eye caught on something she had not seen before, set apart from the others. Down at the far end of the wall, near the teacher's old desk, where the light from the tall window fell most kindly, not a photograph, a frame, and inside it, behind clouded glass, a small square of cloth, a quilt square, pieced and finished, the colors faded soft, the stitching fine and patient and unmistakable, the same hand, the same work as the great quilt folded over her arm at that very moment. But this square was not blank. It had been worked with letters, embroidered slow and careful, the way you stitch a thing you mean to last. Cora crossed the room. Her boots were loud in the quiet. She stood before the little frame and lifted it from its nail with both hands and held it to the light, and she read the name stitched into the cloth. Cora. Her name, not the borrowed name, not Bishop. Just the given name her mother had whispered to her at the end. Cora. Stitched into a square of cloth by the same patient hand that had stitched the island, the same hand that had carved 4 letters low into a door frame before she was ever born. Her knees went soft beneath her. She sank into the dust at the foot of the wall, the little frame in her lap, and she understood at last the thing. The whole house, the whole island, the whole long silence had been holding all this time. The empty squares on the great quilt's hem. The row that had never been finished. They had been left for her. The maker had stitched the whole of the island, season by season, year by year. The house, the path, the shore, the hidden school. And then, at the very end, she had begun a final row. A row of empty squares. And into the first of them she had not yet sewn. She had set instead this single finished square, framed and kept safe, and hung where the light fell kindest. A name, held in waiting, across all the years, for the girl who would come back. And the girl with that name, the orphan who had drifted from house to house, who had no roots, no people, no place that was hers, was sitting on the floor of a forgotten schoolhouse, holding her own name in her hands, stitched there a lifetime before her birth. The face in the photographs was her face because it had always been her face. Not a mystery, not a haunting, not some trick of an old and lonely place. Blood. Nell was her grandmother, the hidden child who had grown into a woman, who had borne a daughter, who had given that daughter the old buried name. And that daughter had been Cora's mother. The warmth, the voice, the song half heard in the dark, the mouth that had whispered at the very end the one word it had time to pass on, and Adeline, gentle Adeline, who had taken in a girl with no people and asked for nothing. Adeline had known, had been told, somehow, across the years, had been entrusted with one quiet task: to keep the girl safe until she was grown, and then, at the last, to set her feet on the path home. Don't let your roots disappear. Cora pressed the framed square to her chest and bowed her head. In the gray and patient light of that hidden room, she wept. Not the way she had wept at funerals, not the hollow, exhausted weeping of someone alone. She wept the way a person weeps when they learn, after a whole lifetime of believing otherwise, that they were never as alone as they had thought. That somewhere, someone had carried them in mind, had stitched their name into cloth, and hung it in the light, and waited, and never quite given up on the day they would walk through the door. She had come to this island believing she had no one, and the island had answered her across 70 silent years with her own name. How long she sat there, she could not have said. But at last she rose. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she looked once more around the long, quiet room, at the faces, at the notes, at the whole gentle life that had been hidden here, and the gentler work it had done, and something settled in her, clear and quiet and certain. Wendell had told her the truth would leave her alone. He was wrong. The truth was the only thing that had ever, in her whole life, reached out and called her by name. She gathered the great quilt, and the framed square, and the journal buttoned safe inside her coat. And she walked out of the schoolhouse, and down through the marked path, past the leaning posts with their faded birds, down out of the green dark, and toward the harbor, and the watching window, and the small, comfortable lie the island had kept so long. She did not go down to hide. She went down to break the silence. It was late afternoon when she came out of the trees. The harbor lay below her in the slanting light, the boats rocking gentle at the dock, the handful of gray roofs, the people about their quiet work. And Cora walked down the hill toward them with the quilt in her arms, and the framed name held against it, and her grandmother's whole hidden life pressed close to her heart. People stopped to watch her come. By ones and twos they paused in doorways, at the dock, by the nets they were mending. A girl from the house on the hill, walking down with something held to her chest like a thing too precious to set down. Wendell was there, near the water. He saw her, and his face went tight and gray. Cora stopped in the open space near the dock where they could all see her, and she did a simple thing. She knelt, and she spread the great quilt out on the ground before them in the slanting light so that the whole stitched island lay open for any eye to read. The house, the shore, the hidden school in the trees, and along the hem, in faded thread, the 4 small words, "She is still alive." "Most of you," she said, and her voice carried, clear and steady in the salt air, "were told a story a long time ago, about a child this island lost to the sea. A stillness spread out across the harbor. It wasn't true, Cora said. She didn't drown. She was hidden, to keep her safe from people who wanted her gone. And she lived. She lived a long, good life, right out there in the trees, in a little school nobody talks about. And she spent that life keeping a door open for anyone who came to this island with nowhere left to go. She looked up and met their eyes, one by one. Some of you know that already, she said softly. Some of you, or your mothers, or your mothers' mothers, found that open door and said nothing, because saying nothing was how this island learned to keep its kindest secret safe. She saw it then, a movement, at the edge of the crowd, an old woman leaning on a younger one's arm, lifting her chin. A man near the nets, setting down his work, his face gone still with old memory. A woman by a doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright. People who knew, people who had been helped or whose blood had been helped by the woman in the trees, people who had kept the gentle half of the silence, while a proud family kept the cruel half. I'm not here to shame anyone, Cora said. The ones who did the cruel thing are gone, but the kind thing isn't gone. It's still out there, and it doesn't deserve to stay a secret anymore. Her voice gentled. Her name was Nell, and it turns out she was my grandmother. The roots I never knew I had, and I'm not going to let her disappear. For a long moment, no one moved, and then the old woman at the edge of the crowd let go of the arm she leaned on and took one slow, deliberate step forward, and spoke, her voice cracked with years. She gave me a place to sleep, the old woman said, the worst winter of my life, and I have held my tongue about it for more years than you've been alive. She looked around at the others, fierce and trembling. I'm done holding it. Another voice, then. The man by the nets. My mother always said there was an angel in the trees. He cleared his throat, rough. She wasn't wrong. And another, and another. Soft voices, breaking the long quiet, one after the next, like the first stones loosed from a dam. Each one a memory, each one a kindness, kept secret for fear, set free at last into the open air. And Wendell stood among them, the man who had run most things on this island for so long. He stood at the edge of the water and watched the silence his family had built come quietly, gently, irreversibly undone. Not by force, not by shame, but by the simple weight of every kept kindness finally let go. His power had never been in money, or boats, or the road on and off the island. It had been in the quiet, and the quiet was over. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply looked for a long moment at the quilt spread open on the ground, at the stitched school in the trees, at the girl kneeling there with her grandmother's name held to her heart. And something in his face, at the very last, let go. He gave a single small nod to her, to the truth, to the end of the long lie his family had asked him to carry. Then he turned and walked away up the harbor road, alone. And Cora knelt in the slanting light, surrounded now, not by strangers, but by voices, by memory, by an island slowly remembering out loud the kindest thing it had ever done, and understood that she had walked down that hill carrying the truth alone, and was not alone anymore. There was only one thing left now, one last thread pulling at her heart, sharper than all the rest. She is still alive. 4 words stitched in faded thread by a hand that had carved her name and waited. Not she lived, not she was, is. And as the voices rose and gentled around her in the dying light, Cora lifted her head and looked back up the green hill, toward the trees, toward the hidden room where a single old woman had been quietly tending an open door, and felt, for the first time in her whole life, the pull of someone still out there, waiting to be found. The light was going gold over the water by the time the harbor grew quiet again. The voices had risen and broken and softened, and at last they had settled into something gentler than the island had felt in a long while. People stood in small clusters near the dock, talking low, the way folks talk when a thing held tight for years has finally been set down. Some had tears on their faces. Some only stood, looking out at the water, remembering things they had not let themselves remember in a long time. Cora knelt in the middle of it all. The great quilt lay spread open before her on the ground, the whole stitched island glowing in the slanting sun. The framed name was still pressed against her chest, and though her knees ached from the cold earth, she did not want to move. It felt, somehow, as though moving might break the spell, and the island might forget again the thing it had just remembered out loud. The old woman who had spoken first, the one with the cane, who had said she was done holding her tongue, came slowly to her side. She lowered herself down with a small grunt onto an overturned crate. For a moment, she said nothing at all. She only looked at the quilt, at the stitched shore, at the little school sewn deep in the green heart of the trees. "You have her face," the old woman said at last, soft, wondering. "I knew it the moment you came walking down off that hill, like a ghost stepping straight out of my girlhood." Cora turned to her. Her voice came out unsteady. "You knew her." "I did." The old woman's eyes were wet and bright in the gold light. "A long time back, when the worst winter of my whole life came down on me, and there was not one place left on this earth that wanted me. Somebody whispered about a door in the trees. So I went, half frozen and half mad with grief. I went." She drew a trembling breath. "And she took me in, fed me, sat with me through the long dark nights, asked me nothing I was not ready to tell, and when the spring came, I could stand up straight again. I have carried her secret every day since, the way you carry a thing you love and fear to lose." Cora's throat ached. "Is she—" The word caught and stuck. She made herself say it. "The quilt says she's still alive. Is that true?" The old woman was quiet a moment. Then she lifted one thin hand and pointed, past the harbor, past the last gray roofs, to the far end of the island, where the cliffs softened down into a low and rocky shore, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a small chimney against the deepening sky. "She doesn't come down much anymore," the old woman said. "Hasn't," these last few years. Folks leave food at her door. She keeps her little garden, and once a week, when the weather lets her, she walks up to that old school in the trees, slow as the turning seasons, and she sweeps the floor, and she dusts off all those pictures, and she sits a while. Her voice caught and trembled. Waiting, I always thought, though I never could say for what. She looked at Cora, and something in her old face broke open, gentle as dawn. For you, child, she said. All this time, she was waiting for you. Cora was on her feet before she knew she had risen. She gathered the quilt with shaking hands, folding it close, the framed square pressed safe beneath it. The old woman watched her, and a smile spread across her lined face, and she waved her on with the back of one hand. Go, she said. Go on now. Don't you keep her waiting one single hour longer than she's already waited. And Cora went. She walked the whole length of the island in the last of the light, past the harbor, where now and again a voice called out to her, soft and kind, and a hand was raised in something that was not quite a wave and not quite a blessing, but a little of both. Past the gray houses, where faces appeared in lamplit windows to watch her pass, and she found herself, to her own surprise, lifting her hand to them in return. Down the long, rough road that ran along the shore, the sea lay on one side of her, dark and patient and gently breathing. The pines stood close and black on the other. And above it all, the first stars were beginning to prick through the deepening blue. Her heart beat hard the whole way, but not with fear now, with something she had little practice carrying. Hope. She had spent her whole life schooling herself out of hope. Hope was the thing that broke a person, she had learned early and often and hard. Hope was the open hand the world loved to slap away. And so she had grown careful, guarded, so practiced at expecting nothing that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to walk toward a thing instead of away from it. But she walked toward that thin curl of smoke now with her whole heart climbing up into her throat. A grandmother. The word would barely fit inside her. She had no people. She had never had people. That had been the one fixed fact of her whole life, the cold stone she had built herself around. And yet, ahead of her, behind a small door at the very edge of the sea, was a woman whose blood ran in her own veins, whose face she wore as her own, who had stitched her name into cloth and hung it in the kindest light and waited across all the long and silent years for the day it might come walking up the shore. The cottage came into view as the stars thickened overhead. It was small and low, and kept with the particular care of a place loved by someone who has little strength left, but a great deal of tenderness. A garden lay beside it, tidy even now, the late vegetables standing patient in their rows. A lamp glowed warm and gold in the single window, and the smoke rose soft and steady from the chimney, up into the dark. Cora stopped at the gate. For a long moment she could not make herself go through it. Her hand rested on the worn top rail of the gate. Her breath came shallow, and everything in her, every old and aching instinct she had spent a lifetime learning to trust, rose up at once and told her that good things did not happen to a girl like her. That the door would open onto disappointment, the way so many doors had opened onto disappointment before. Then she thought of the 4 little birds, stitched into the corners of the quilt, wings open, lifting. And she opened the gate and walked up the short path. And she knocked. There was a long silence. Then, from within, the slow sound of a chair pushed back, of footsteps, careful and unhurried, crossing a small room, the scrape of an old latch lifted by a hand that was in no great hurry, because it had learned across a long life that there was no point in hurrying toward most things. The door opened, and there she stood, an old woman, small and bent with the weight of her years, her hair gone fully to silver and pulled back soft from her face. A face lined deep by a long life lived close to the sea. A face Cora had seen 100 times that week, in faded photographs, in a hat box, across the whole long wall of a hidden school in the trees, the same dark eyes, gone pale now, but steady, the same narrow chin, and there, above the brow, almost lost among the soft lines of age, a small, pale scar. The 2 women looked at one another across the threshold. Neither spoke. The lamp flickered warm behind the old woman. The sea breathed soft against the rocks below the cottage. And in the long, trembling silence, Cora watched the old woman's pale eyes travel slowly over her face, the dark hair, the chin, the small scar above the brow, and fill, slowly, like a cup held under a gentle stream, with tears. "Oh," the old woman whispered, "just that. One small sound, broken wide open with a whole lifetime of waiting inside it. Oh, you came." Cora's own face crumpled. The quilt nearly slipped from her arms. "I didn't know," she said, the words tumbling out, thick and breaking. "All this time, I didn't know there was anyone. I thought I was the last of everything. I thought I had nobody in the whole world." "You never did." The old woman reached out with one thin and trembling hand and laid it against Cora's wet cheek. Her touch was light as a fallen leaf, and warm as the lamp behind her. "You never did, child. You only didn't know where to look." And then the old woman's whole face broke into a smile, watery, radiant, completely undone, and she opened her arms, and Cora, the orphan who had spent her whole life learning, carefully, painfully, not to need anyone at all, stepped into them and was held. They held each other a long while, there in the lamplit doorway, while the stars came out in their slow thousands over the dark sea, and the smoke rose soft from the chimney, and the world, for once, asked nothing of either of them. The old woman made tea. It took her a long time. Her hands were slow and unsteady, and Cora ached to leap up and help, and somehow understood that she should not, that the doing of it mattered, that after so many years of setting out one cup, the old woman needed, to set out 2 with her own hands. So Cora sat at the small table in the warm little room and watched. She watched her grandmother fill the kettle and find the cups and lay out 2 small plates, the way the table in the empty house up on the hill had been laid all those days ago, for 2. And she understood it now. It had been Nell, once, long ago, setting a table for 2 in a house she could no longer bear to live in alone, because to set it for one was more than her heart could carry, a small, stubborn act of faith, a place laid for someone not yet arrived. When the tea was poured at last, the old woman lowered herself into the chair across the table. She folded her thin hands around the warmth of her cup, and she looked at her granddaughter for a long, full moment, as if she still could not quite trust the sight of her. "Your mother had your eyes," she said softly, "and mine. We all of us carry that little mark, you know." She touched the scar above her own brow, gentle. "Hand it down, like the name, a sign almost, so that we'd know our own, if ever we found them again." "She told me the name," Cora whispered. "At the very end. I never knew what it meant. I carried it for years and never understood." "She would not have had the time to tell you all of it." The old woman's eyes dimmed with an old, soft sorrow. "I sent her away from here, you understand, when she was young, to keep her safe, to give her a fighting chance at an ordinary life, far from the long shadow this place had cast over mine." She looked down at her tea. "It cost me a great deal to do it," she said quietly. "To let my own girl go out into the world, knowing I might not see her again. But I would not have her grow up the way I did, hidden, quiet, always afraid. I wanted her free, even if free meant far. And so I let her go. And I stayed, and I kept the door." Cora's hand found the old woman's across the table and held it. "What happened to you?" she asked gently. "The journal. It circled it. It never quite said." The old woman was silent a moment. Then she told it. Not the whole of it. The long years had worn the sharp edges down, and what was left she gave plainly, without horror, the way the very old can speak of very old griefs. As facts, now, more than wounds. A child, long ago, on this island. A proud family that had come to find her presence inconvenient, for reasons that had to do with money and shame and a name they were determined to keep spotless. A story given to the harbor about a drowning, because a drowned child is mourned for one sad season and then is finished, and the water keeps her quiet, while a living one is a danger that never ends. "They came to call my old life before the sea," the old woman said softly, "as though the day the water was said to take me was the day one life ended, and another, a hidden one, quietly began. And a few good souls, a teacher chiefly, and a handful of others, who could not stop the lie, but who would not, for all that, let the child be swallowed up inside it, who carried her into the trees by night, and hid her in the small abandoned school, and kept her alive. They saved my life," the old woman said simply, "but they could not give me one. A life is not a thing another person can hand you, ready-made. So I made my own, out there in that one small room among the pines. I taught myself my letters, from the books they left behind. I taught myself to sew. I learned the birds and the tides, and the way the fog rolls in off the water of a morning." Her pale eyes shone. "And I learned the one thing that mattered more than any of the rest." She leaned forward, slow. "The worst part of being hidden away," she said, "was never the hiding itself. It was the believing. Believing that no one out there would ever come. That no one would remember a girl the sea was said to have taken. That no one, anywhere, would care whether the door of that little room was opened or kept shut forever. She squeezed Cora's hand. That is the thing that breaks a person, child. Not the dark, the certainty of being forgotten in it. The lamp burned low and warm between them. Outside, the sea kept its soft and patient time against the rocks. So when I was grown at last, the old woman went on, and the danger was long past, and the cruel ones long since gone into the ground, I made a choice. I could have walked off this island and never once looked back. There was nothing to hold me to it but bad memory. A slow, certain smile crept across her lined face, but I kept thinking of all the others, all the ones still out there in the wide world, feeling the way I had once felt, forgotten, invisible, certain that no door would ever open for them. She spread one thin hand, and I decided that I would keep mine open for as long as I had breath to keep it so. Cora's eyes spilled over. The school, she said, the strangers on the wall, the notes, anyone who needed it, the old woman said softly. I marked the path with little birds, so the lost could find their way through the trees. And I fed them, and I sat with them in the firelight, and I asked them nothing at all. The way someone once had done for me. Her voice gentled almost to nothing. Being remembered, child, it does not save a soul. I learned that out in those trees, across all those years. It is a small and lonely thing, in the end, to be only remembered. She looked at Cora, and her pale eyes were very clear. What saves us, she said, is giving someone else a place to belong. That is the whole of it. The only true mending I ever found for the broken parts in a person. You give away the very thing you were never given, and in the giving, it comes back to you whole. And Cora, sitting in that small bright room at the edge of the dark and breathing sea, holding the warm and trembling hand of a woman she had not known 3 days before, that she had felt something inside her, some long frozen thing set hard in her since childhood, begin very quietly to thaw. She stayed. There had never been any real question of it. There was nothing for her on the mainland and everything for her here. She brought her single bag down to the cottage by the sea, and through the soft and lengthening weeks that followed, she learned the shape of her grandmother's days, the slow tea and the gray of the mornings, the tending of the small garden, row by row, the gathering of driftwood along the shore, the careful, unhurried rhythm of a life lived in time with the tides, where nothing was rushed because there was no longer any reason to rush. And she learned her grandmother's hands, for the great quilt was not finished. Cora had known that from the first night she unfolded it in the cellar, the long row of empty squares along the hem, the fine work set down one evening by lamplight, and never taken up again. One quiet afternoon, with the light coming soft and slanting through the cottage window, Cora spread the quilt across the table and asked about it. The old woman ran her thin fingers slowly along the unfinished row, and smiled. I stopped there on purpose, she said. A great many years ago now, back when my hands could still manage the fine work without shaking. She touched the first bare square with one fingertip. I had stitched the whole of the island into it by then. Every place I loved, every path I had walked. And then I came to the end. and I found that I could not finish it, not for anything. Why? Cora asked, soft. Because a quilt like this one is not only a map, child. The old woman's eyes lifted to hers. It is a family, and there was a part of my family I had never once laid eyes on. A part still out there in the world somewhere. A girl I hoped, with everything left in me, would one day find her way home. Her hand pressed flat against the empty squares. So I left the last row bare, she said, and I stitched one single square with a name upon it, and I hung it in the school where the light fell kindest of all, and I left the rest of the work undone, for the one who would come back to finish it. Cora's breath caught hard in her chest. The square, she whispered, with my name, with your name. The old woman's eyes shone bright as the lamp. Your mother told me before she went away from here what she would call you if she were ever blessed with a girl. And so I made the square, and I waited. I did not know, child, if it would ever be filled. Some days I was sure it would not be. A soft, trembling breath. But I made it all the same, because hope, real hope, is a thing you stitch even when you cannot see the end of the row. You set the needle in, and you trust the rest to come. She took Cora's hand and pressed it gently against the bare squares of the hem. It was meant for you, she said. The finishing of it. Not for my old hands, for yours. The one who came home was always meant to sew the last of the stitches herself. And so Cora learned to sew. Her grandmother taught her, slow and patient, through the long and lengthening evenings by the fire, how to thread the needle in the soft lamplight, how to set the small, even stitches in a line, how to piece the bits of cloth so the colors sang together instead of fighting. Cora's first squares were clumsy things, the stitches crooked, the corners puckered. She laughed at them, soft and rueful, and unpicked them, and tried again. And the old woman watched from her chair by the fire, and corrected with a gentle word here and there, and beamed at every small improvement as though it hung the moon. Square by patient square, the empty row began to fill, and into it Cora stitched the new things. Not only the old island the woman had loved and mapped so long ago. She added the little cottage by the sea with its tidy garden. She added the harbor with its scatter of gray roofs, no longer a place of secrets kept in fear, but of voices set free into the salt air. And at the very last, in the final empty square, where the whole quilt had waited so very long for its ending, she sewed her own name, Cora, the same 4 letters carved low into a door frame before she was ever born, the same name stitched and framed and hung in the kindest light, now set at last, in her own careful and unsteady hand, into the heart of the family she had not known she had. When it was done, the two of them held the finished quilt up between them in the morning light, and looked at it together, and for a long while neither could find a single word. A whole island, a whole family, a whole long story of hiding and keeping and waiting, and coming home at last, worked there in faded thread and bright, every empty place filled, every silence answered, and the four little birds in the corners seemed almost, in the slanting light, to lift their wings. They hung it in the window of the house on the hill, for Cora had decided the little cottage by the sea belonged to her grandmother, and she would not take the old woman from the shore she loved. But the house on the hill, the house that had carved her name and waited so long, the house with the table set so faithfully for two, that house she would bring all the way back to life. Through the soft turning of the seasons, she did. She mended the sagging roof. She hung a new shutter where the storm had torn the old one down. She scrubbed and painted and coaxed the tired old place back from its long gray sleep, room by room, the way she had begun on that very first cold and frightened morning. And the islanders came up the hill. They came now not in suspicion, but in kindness. A man arrived one morning with a box of tools and stayed 3 days to set the porch right. A woman brought curtains she had sewn herself. The old one with the cane sent up a basket of cuttings for the garden, and instructions, delivered through her granddaughter, on exactly how they were to be planted. The house that had stood alone above the sea for so long was not alone any more. And in the front window, where the morning light fell first and warmest of all, Cora hung the finished quilt, so that anyone climbing the long path up the hill would catch sight of it from far off. The whole stitched island, glowing in the sun, a signal of a sort that the house had woken, that someone was within its walls, that a door up here at the top of the world stood open. She thought often, in those gentle days, of the thing her grandmother had told her over the tea, that being remembered does not save a person, that what mends the broken places is the giving of a place to belong. And slowly, Cora came to understand the whole of what the long mystery had been leading her toward. The journal, the quilt, the hidden school, the buried name. None of it had been the true heart of the thing. The treasure had never been a secret waiting in the dark to be dug up and held to the light. The heart of it was this: a girl who had believed her whole life long that she belonged nowhere on this earth, learning at last that she had always belonged somewhere, and then turning, with that warm knowledge cupped in her 2 hands, to make a place where others might come to belong, too. The house had not been waiting all those years for someone to uncover its past. It had been waiting for someone to carry its purpose on. There was one thing more. On a high shelf in her grandmother's cottage, wrapped in a square of soft cloth, sat an old and well-worn book. Not the journal, another. The old woman brought it down one quiet evening, and laid it on the table between them, and opened it with slow and reverent hands. Inside, in fading ink, were names, a long column of them, running back and back through the years, the names of a family, Cora's family, the roots, she had been told, by a dying woman's last gentle breath, not to let disappear. And there, near the bottom of the long column, in the old woman's careful hand, was Nell's own name, and beneath it, her daughter's, Cora's mother, the warmth, the voice, the song half heard in the dark before sleep, and below that, a single empty line. The old woman set the pen in Cora's hand and closed her own thin fingers around it for a moment. "Write it," she said softly. "You're the next, child. You always were. From the very day you were born, there was a line in this book waiting for your hand." And Cora bent over the book and steadied her shaking hand and wrote her name beneath all the others. Cora, no longer the last of nothing, no longer a girl with no people, drifting from one borrowed house to the next, bracing herself for the world to take whatever she dared to love. She was a name in a long line of names, the newest root of an old, old tree, the first, perhaps, of something new. Just beginning. The old woman lived to see the house on the hill brought all the way back to life. She walked up there, slow as the seasons, leaning on her granddaughter's arm. And she stood in the front room where the morning light poured through the colors of the quilt and scattered blue and rose across the swept and shining floor. And she wept, quietly, with a joy too large for words. She sat at the table that was set for two, and this time both chairs were filled. She taught Cora the last of what she knew, the marking of the path with its small lifting birds, the keeping and the sweeping of the old school in the trees, and the quiet, patient art of sitting beside a frightened soul in the firelight and asking them nothing at all they were not yet ready to give. She did not take the work back into her own old hands. That had never been her way, and it was not the point of any of it. She only stood beside her granddaughter, a gentle voice at her shoulder, and let Cora carry it forward now as her own. And when, in the fullness of time, the old woman grew quiet in the way that does not pass, she did so in peace, in her own bed. Within sound of the sea she had loved her whole long life, with her granddaughter's hand held warm in hers, and the family book complete upon the shelf, and the long, long waiting finally, gently over. Her last words were not sorrowful. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her pale eyes finding Cora's in the lamplight, "that no one would ever come." And then she smiled. And then, one day, you did. And so the work passed on, not as a secret whispered in fear among the trees, but as a quiet, open thing. A small, steady light at the top of a green hill, above a patient sea. Cora kept the path marked, with its little lifting birds. She kept the old school swept and warm. And when, now and again, a stranger climbed that hill with a worn bag and eyes that did not dare to lift from the ground, she did not ask them where they had come from, or why. She had learned by then that the asking comes later. She only set out a second cup, the way a table had once been set, long ago, for someone not yet arrived. The house no longer stood alone above the sea. It stood awake, and tended, and full of light, and of voices, and of the small, unhurried kindnesses passed from one weary soul to the next. And on the soft, bright mornings, when the sun climbed up over the water and poured through the colors of the finished quilt, scattering blue and rose across the floorboards, the 4 little stitched birds in its corners seemed to catch the light and lift, wings open, rising, the way a thing rises at the very last when it has finally, after so long a journey, found its way home.